Winter, 1389. Kenilworth Castle, England. Outside temperature, 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside Lord Edmund's chamber, his bedding system generates an R value of 12 to 15. That outperforms a modern Arctic-rated sleeping bag rated for -4 degrees Fahrenheit. He has no electricity. Because that number should be impossible, we're going to pull apart exactly how medieval sleepers built warmth systems that modern engineering still hasn't matched. You'll discover why a single kilogram of wool outperforms an electric blanket running for hours. You'll learn how an enclosed wooden bed frame creates a microclimate 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the surrounding room. You'll understand the layering sequence that reduces heat loss through the floor by 30%, and why that floor insulation is the piece modern bedding almost always ignores. Starting with the material that made all of it possible. If you value research that goes this deep into history and physics, subscribe. It keeps this work going. Drop your city in the comments. Now, into the cold. Before we get into the mechanics, understand the world these sleepers inhabited. Medieval Europe had no central heating, no thermostats, no synthetic insulation rated for specific temperatures. What it had was cold, persistent structural cold. Stone walls, earthen floors, gaps in timber frames that funneled wind directly into sleeping spaces. In northern regions, winter nights regularly dropped below 0 Fahrenheit. In damp climates like England and the Low Countries, the cold was wet cold, which is physiologically more dangerous because moisture accelerates heat loss from the body at a rate far exceeding dry air at the same temperature. Sleeping arrangements divided sharply by class. Farmhands slept on wooden benches with minimal covering. Monks followed strict schedules dictated by the rule of St. Benedict, sleeping from roughly 7 in the evening until matins around 2 in the morning, then returning to sleep until dawn prayers. Higher classes slept in proper beds, elevated from the floor, enclosed by wooden panels or heavy curtains. But across every class, the fundamental challenge was identical. The human body generates heat, and that heat vanishes the moment it contacts cold air, a cold surface, or moisture. Medieval bedding engineers, and that is precisely what they were, solved this through 3 interlocking systems. First, material selection that worked with the body's own thermal output. Second, layering sequences that addressed heat loss from every direction simultaneously. Third, architectural enclosure that converted a cold room into an irrelevant variable. The result, as documented in Lord Edmund's 1389 bedding inventory, was a system with an estimated R value of 12 to 15. For context, modern Arctic-rated sleeping bags designed for -4 degrees Fahrenheit carry an R value of approximately 8. Lord Edmund's bed exceeded that without a single synthetic fiber, without electricity, and without any technology invented after the 14th century. Now, the engine behind all of it, wool, not as a fabric, as a thermal system. Each wool fiber is a coiled spring. Under magnification, the surface reveals overlapping scales, like roof tiles, stacked in sequence. Between those scales, microscopic air pockets form, millions of them per square centimeter of fabric. Air, when held still, is the single most effective insulating medium available. The problem with most insulation is that air moves. Convection carries heat away. Wool's fiber structure locks air in place, converting it from a heat-conducting medium into a heat-retaining one. But that is only the beginning of what wool does. Wool fibers can absorb approximately 1/3 of their own weight in water vapor without registering as wet to the touch. This is not a minor detail. It is the difference between surviving a cold, damp night and not surviving one. When a sleeper sweats, that moisture, if it reaches the outer insulating layers, destroys their effectiveness. Cotton becomes cold and clammy. Synthetic fibers trap liquid sweat against the skin, accelerating evaporative cooling. Wool absorbs vapor at the fiber level before it can condense into liquid, then releases it slowly as the night cools. There is a second mechanism that most analyses overlook. Wool generates heat during moisture absorption. The chemical process of water molecules bonding to wool fiber proteins releases energy as heat. Researchers at Historia Prime's documentary series, drawing on textile physics literature, describe this as the heat of absorption. A kilogram of wool, actively managing a sleeper's moisture output, generates warmth comparable to an electric blanket running for hours, not as a metaphor, as a measurable thermal output. Medieval bedding systems used wool at multiple layers simultaneously. The layer against the skin was linen or cotton, chosen specifically because these materials wick vapor away from the skin's surface quickly, handing it off to the wool layers above before evaporative cooling can begin. Over the linen sat the wool blankets, 1, 2, sometimes 3, each trapping its own column of still air. Over those, a heavy outer covering, often fur-lined in wealthier households, provided wind resistance and radiant heat reflection. Here is where the layering principle diverges sharply from modern intuition. One thick blanket is not equivalent to 3 thinner blankets of the same total weight. A single thick blanket compresses under its own mass, collapsing the air pockets that provide insulation. 3 separate blankets maintain independent air columns between each layer. The interfaces between blankets become additional insulating zones. The total thermal resistance of the system is substantially higher than any single layer equivalent. But the layering above the body addressed only two of the three primary heat loss mechanisms: convection from the surrounding air, radiation from the body's surface. The third mechanism, conduction directly into the sleeping surface below, was equally critical, and it is the mechanism modern bedding almost universally neglects. The ground, or any cold surface beneath a sleeper, draws heat downward through direct contact. Medieval mattress construction countered this with straw. Packed straw, sometimes mixed with dried herbs for moisture management and pest deterrence, formed a thick insulating foundation. The straw layer worked identically to the wool above, trapped air pockets preventing conductive heat transfer. A sleeper lying on a deep straw mattress was effectively suspended above the cold floor on a column of still air. Research from Historia Prime's January 2026 documentary on peasant sleeping in damp conditions adds a detail that reframes the entire system. Medieval peasants in wet climates did not try to keep straw dry. They used straw as a sacrificial layer, designed to absorb moisture before it could reach the sleeper or the wool blankets above. The straw degraded. It was replaced up to 4 times per year in better households, at least annually in simpler ones. The system was designed for maintenance, not permanence. The straw was not failing when it absorbed moisture. It was functioning exactly as intended. Wool underneath the sleeper, placed between the body and the straw mattress, reduced heat loss through the sleeping surface by approximately 30%. That single addition, a wool foundation layer beneath the body, not above it, accounts for a thermal improvement that no amount of additional top covering can replicate. Which brings us to the structure that converted all of these material advantages into something approaching a complete thermal environment. The enclosed bed. And what happens inside one changes the entire calculation of how warmth works. The enclosed bed was not furniture, it was engineering. Picture the structure. Lord Edmund slept inside at Kenilworth in 1389. 4 heavy oak posts, floor to ceiling, wooden panels on 3 sides, solid and fitted tight, thick wool curtains on the 4th, drawn closed the moment he climbed in. The result was not a bed inside a room. It was a room inside a room, a sealed thermal chamber roughly 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, built entirely around a single human body. Here is what happens inside that enclosure within the first 30 minutes of sleep. The human body radiates heat continuously. In an open room, that heat rises, disperses, and is lost to the surrounding air volume. Stone walls absorb it, cold drafts carry it away. The body generates warmth, and the room consumes it faster than any sleeper can replace it. But inside an enclosed bed, that radiant heat has nowhere to go. The wooden panels reflect it back. The curtains trap it. The air volume inside the enclosure is small enough, roughly 48 cubic feet in a standard medieval box bed, that the body's own output can raise and maintain the internal temperature meaningfully. According to Historia Prime's December 2025 documentary on medieval heating principles, the temperature differential between the interior of a curtained canopy bed and the surrounding room reached 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit under sustained sleeping conditions. Not 15 to 20 degrees warmer than outside, 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the room the bed sat inside. If the room was 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of the bed approached 55 to 60 degrees. The sleeper's own body did that. The enclosure simply refused to let the warmth escape. But the enclosure accomplished something beyond temperature. It eliminated convection entirely. Convection is moving air. Moving air strips heat from surfaces at a rate that still, stagnant air cannot. A draft of 3 miles per hour across exposed skin accelerates heat loss by a factor that no additional blanket layer can compensate for. Medieval builders understood this not in those terms, but in observed outcome. A bed with curtains drawn kept a sleeper warm. A bed with curtains open did not. The curtains were not decorative. They were the convection barrier. Once drawn, the air inside the enclosure stopped moving. It became dead air. And dead air, as established earlier with wool's fiber structure, is the most effective insulating medium that exists. The wooden panels added a second function that modern analysis consistently underestimates. Wood is a poor conductor of heat. Stone conducts cold aggressively. An unenclosed bed against a stone wall loses heat through radiation and conduction into that wall throughout the night. Wooden panels create an air gap between the sleeper and the stone. That gap, even a few inches, interrupts the conductive pathway. The cold wall becomes thermally irrelevant. The sleeper is insulated from the architecture of the building itself. Wealthier households added a further refinement. The interior surfaces of the wooden panels were sometimes lined with fabric, wool, or heavy linen, which added a radiant heat reflection layer. The body's infrared output, instead of being absorbed by wood, was partially reflected back toward the sleeper. The system was capturing heat from 3 directions simultaneously, reflecting radiant output back inward, blocking convective drafts with curtains, interrupting conductive loss through wooden panels, all 3 primary heat loss mechanisms addressed within a single architectural structure. The enclosed bed also solved a problem the layered blankets and straw foundation could not: the temperature of the air the sleeper breathed. In an open room at 23 degrees Fahrenheit, every breath draws in frigid air. The body expends energy-warming inhaled air before it reaches the lungs. Over 8 hours of sleep, that cumulative thermal cost is significant. Inside an enclosed bed, the air temperature rises with the sleeper. Breathing becomes less physiologically expensive. The body's heat budget, the total warmth it generates and must sustain, is conserved from multiple directions at once. This is the principle that modern heated blankets fundamentally miss. A heated blanket adds energy to the system from an external source. It compensates for heat loss rather than preventing it. The enclosed bed prevented loss first, then let the body's own output do the remaining work. It was not a heat source, it was a heat trap. And a heat trap that requires no fuel, no electricity, and no maintenance beyond drawing a curtain is a more resilient system than any powered alternative. The wool, the straw, the layering sequence, and the enclosed structure were not four separate solutions. They were one integrated system, each component addressing the failure modes of the others. Wool managed moisture the straw could not. Straw insulated the floor the wool blankets could not reach. The enclosure controlled convection and radiation that no amount of material layering could stop on its own. Remove any one component, and the system degrades. Keep all four, and you arrive at an R value of 12 to 15 in a 14th century English castle with no power source except the body sleeping inside it. Which raises the question that the title of this documentary has been holding in reserve. We have covered the materials, we have covered the layering sequence, we have covered the enclosure, but we have not yet addressed the specific pillow configuration that medieval sleepers used inside that enclosure, and why that configuration, the stacking rule itself, added a thermal dimension that none of the other components could replicate on their own. So the system is complete, except it is not. Because inside that enclosed thermal chamber with the curtains drawn and the dead air locked in place, medieval sleepers did one more thing, something that looks, from a modern perspective, almost absurdly simple. They stacked their pillows in a specific sequence. And that sequence was not about comfort. It was about closing the one gap the enclosure, the wool, and the straw could not seal on their own. The head is the problem, not the body. The body, wrapped in linen, covered by 2 or 3 wool blankets, tucked beneath a fur-lined coverlet, insulated below by a wool foundation layer sitting on packed straw, is thermally managed. The system handles the body well, but the head sits above the blanket line, exposed, and the head is not a minor thermal variable. The human skull, with its dense network of surface blood vessels and its constant requirement to radiate heat for brain temperature regulation, loses warmth faster per square inch than almost any other body surface. In a sealed enclosure, where the air has been warmed to 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit by the body's own output, an exposed head sitting above the blanket line acts as a continuous exhaust vent. It bleeds warmth upward into the canopy space, slowly, steadily, all night. Medieval sleepers understood this outcome without understanding the mechanism. The solution was the bolster, a long cylindrical pillow typically stuffed with the same wool or wool and feather mixture used in the mattress itself, placed horizontally across the bed at shoulder height, not under the head, at the shoulders. Its function was to create a raised threshold, a soft wall that allowed the blankets to be drawn up higher without collapsing onto the face. The blanket line could now reach the jaw rather than the chest. The gap between the top of the blanket coverage and the ambient air of the enclosure shrank by several critical inches. Over the bolster, a second pillow, smaller, softer, stuffed with down or fine wool. This one sat behind the head and neck, angled slightly forward. Illuminated manuscripts from England and France, including several from the late 14th century, consistently show sleepers depicted in this semi-reclined position, head and neck supported from behind, chin slightly lowered. Bernadette Banner's February 2023 analysis of medieval bed construction noted that manuscript imagery suggests sleepers sat up slightly rather than lying fully flat, and that the bolster and a secondary pillow arrangement appears integrated with the mattress system rather than separate from it. The positioning was not arbitrary. A head angled slightly forward, chin toward the chest, dramatically reduces the exposed surface area of the neck. The neck, like the skull, is dense with surface vasculature. Reducing its exposure to ambient air reduces radiant heat loss from one of the body's highest output thermal zones. The third element of the stacking rule, where the rule gets its name, was the placement of a smaller folded cloth or tertiary cushion against the back of the neck itself, between the secondary pillow and the collar of the outer blanket. This was not universal across all classes. It appears more consistently in household inventories and manuscript depictions from wealthier English and French households in the 13th and 14th centuries. But its function is measurable. That folded layer, pressed between neck and pillow, eliminated the convective gap that forms when a head shifts during sleep and pulls the blanket edge away from the neck, Without it, every movement creates a momentary draft channel directly against exposed skin at the neck's pulse points. With it, the neck remains sealed regardless of head position. 3 elements. Bolster at the shoulders to raise the blanket threshold. Secondary pillow behind the head to angle the chin forward and reduce neck exposure. Tertiary fold at the nape to seal the remaining gap against movement. Together, they closed the thermal circuit the rest of the system left open. The head was not insulated the way the body was insulated, but it was managed. Its heat loss was slowed, its exposure reduced, and the warm air column inside the enclosure was no longer being continuously vented upward through an unaddressed gap at the top of the blanket line. This is why the pillow configuration mattered as a thermal mechanism rather than a comfort preference. Comfort was a consequence. The cause was heat retention at the body's single largest unmanaged loss point. And the reason modern sleepers never think about this is that modern bedrooms are heated rooms. The ambient air is already warm. The head's radiant loss into that air costs almost nothing. But inside a stone castle at 23 degrees Fahrenheit, with the room itself at 40 degrees even after the enclosure raises the bed interior to 55, the head's thermal output is not trivial. It is the margin between a system that holds its warmth through 8 hours of sleep and one that slowly fails toward dawn when outside temperatures drop lowest and the body's own heat generation slows with deepening sleep. The full system, then, is not 4 components. It is 5. And the 5th one fits in the palm of your hand. Now consider what the 5-component system actually meant in practice, not as a set of instructions, as a nightly ritual. Because medieval sleepers did not think about R values or convective barriers, they thought about surviving the night warm. And the way they did that was through sequence. Every element placed in a specific order, for a specific reason, before the curtain was drawn. This is the part that modern analysis consistently misses. The components were not just correct. The order in which they were assembled mattered as much as the components themselves. Start from the floor up. The straw mattress goes down first, thick enough to suspend the body above the cold stone or earthen surface beneath. Then the wool foundation layer, laid directly over the straw before the sleeper lies down, not on top of the sleeper, under the sleeper. That 30% reduction in conductive heat loss happens before the body ever makes contact with the bed. It is already working before the night begins. Then the sleeper, dressed in linen against the skin, because linen wicks vapor away from the body's surface in the first hours of sleep when sweating is most active. Over the linen, the first wool blanket, then the second, then the third in colder months, each one independent, each one maintaining its own column of still air. Over all of that, the fur-lined coverlet, which in Lord Edmund's household at Kenilworth in 1389, sat as the outermost wind-resistant shell, reflecting radiant heat back inward and sealing the top of the system against any air movement that penetrated the curtains. Then the bolster, placed at shoulder height before the sleeper reclines fully. Then the secondary pillow, positioned behind the head to angle the chin slightly forward. Then the tertiary fold pressed against the nape of the neck. Then the curtain drawn. The sequence took perhaps 3 to 4 minutes. What it created lasted 8 hours. Here is the detail that reframes the entire system from a modern perspective. Medieval sleepers were not reacting to cold, they were preempting it. Every layer was in place before the body began losing heat. The straw was already insulating, the wool was already trapping air, the enclosure was already sealed. The body's thermal output had nowhere to go from the first moment of sleep. The system was not warming a cold sleeper, it was maintaining a warm one. Modern heated blankets work in the opposite direction. A sleeper gets into a cold bed. The blanket begins adding heat to compensate for the cold that has already penetrated. The body has already lost warmth to the mattress below, to the air above, to the pillow beside the neck. The blanket adds energy to recover what was lost. It is remediation, not prevention. And remediation is always less efficient than prevention because you are spending energy to replace warmth that should never have escaped. Medical texts from the 15th through 18th centuries, as documented by historian Roger E. Kirch of Virginia Tech University in his research on pre-industrial sleep, advised sleepers to position themselves on the right side during the first sleep, then shift to the left for the second. The first sleep ran roughly 4 hours, the second another 4, with a waking period between them around midnight. That biphasic structure, documented across England, France, where it was called premier somme, and Italy, where it was primo sonno, meant the bedding system had to sustain warmth through 2 separate sleep cycles and a waking interval. A system that failed at 3 in the morning, when outside temperatures dropped lowest, was not a system at all. The pillow stacking rule addressed exactly that failure point. The neck seal provided by the tertiary fold was most critical, not at the beginning of sleep, but at the transition between first and second sleep, when a sleeper woke, moved, perhaps rose briefly, and then returned to bed. Every movement during that interval risked disrupting the thermal seal at the neck. The tertiary fold reset that seal automatically with each return to the pillow. It required no adjustment. No conscious repositioning. It worked because it was structural, not behavioral. 5 components, specific sequence, sustained across 8 hours and 2 sleep cycles. That is the complete system. And the question it leaves open is the one this documentary began with. If medieval sleepers built something this effective without a single modern material or power source, what exactly did we lose when we stopped building it? What we lost is not a mystery, it is a decision. A series of decisions made incrementally over roughly 2 centuries, each one trading resilience for convenience. And the result is a modern sleeper who spends more money on bedding than Lord Edmund spent on an entire season of household provisions and wakes up colder. The transition happened in stages. The first stage was architectural. As coal heating expanded through English and Northern European households in the 17th and 18th centuries, the enclosed bed became less necessary. Rooms could be held above freezing without the sleeper's own body doing all the thermal work. The curtains came down first, then the wooden panels were simplified. By the early 20th century, the bedbox that Living Edge documented in February 2026 as a potential design revival had disappeared almost entirely from Western European bedrooms. What replaced it was the open bed, aesthetically cleaner, thermally catastrophic by medieval standards. A body lying in an open room loses heat in all 3 directions simultaneously, with no enclosure to reflect it back, no dead air column to hold it, no wooden barrier between skin and the cold stone logic of the walls. The second stage was material. Synthetic fibers arrived in the mid-20th century, promising warmth without weight. They delivered on weight. They failed on the mechanism that mattered most. A synthetic blanket traps air when new, but it cannot manage moisture. It cannot generate heat through absorption. When a sleeper sweats into a synthetic fill, the fill compresses, the air pockets collapse, and the insulation value drops precisely when the body needs it most, in the second half of the night, when core temperature falls and moisture output has been accumulating for hours. Wool, as established earlier, responds to that moisture by generating heat. Synthetics respond by losing loft. The failure mode is built into the material. The third stage was the one nobody noticed because it looked like progress: central heating. A thermostat set to 68 degrees Fahrenheit eliminates the need to think about any of this. The room is warm, the bed is warm, the pillow configuration is irrelevant. Comfort is ambient, not engineered. And so the knowledge dissolved, not dramatically, not in a single generation. It simply stopped being transmitted because it stopped being necessary. The bolster at the shoulder height, the secondary pillow angled behind the neck, the tertiary fold at the nape, 3 minutes of deliberate assembly before drawing the curtain, all of it became archaic, then forgotten. Here's what that forgetting costs in practical terms. A power outage in January, outside temperature dropping to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Modern bedroom, modern bedding, no heat. The average person in that situation has a mattress that conducts cold upward from the frame, a synthetic comforter that loses 30 to 40% of its insulation value when compressed by body weight, no enclosure, no convection barrier, and a pillow that does nothing for the next thermal exposure. They are cold within 2 hours. They wake repeatedly. They add layers that don't work because they're adding them in the wrong order, on top instead of underneath, thick instead of layered, open instead of enclosed. Lord Edmund's system, reassembled in that same room, would hold warmth through the night. Straw or a thick wool mattress topper underneath, wool foundation layer beneath the body, linen against the skin, 2 or 3 wool blankets in sequence, heavy outer covering on top, bolster at the shoulders, secondary pillow behind the head, tertiary fold at the nape, heavy curtains drawn around the bed frame, even improvised ones. The sequence takes 3 minutes. The physics are identical to 1489. The R value approaches 12 to 15. The electricity requirement is 0. That is what was lost. Not the materials, which still exist, not the physics, which never changed. The sequence, the understanding that warmth is not added from outside, but preserved from within, that the body is the heat source and the system's only job is to refuse to let that heat escape. Medieval sleepers knew this not as theory, but as survival. They built it into the ritual of going to bed every night for centuries, the curtain drawn, the neck sealed, the cold made irrelevant. A system so complete that 600 years later, with every material advantage modern engineering can offer, we have not built anything that matches it. There is one more detail from Lord Edmund's 1389 inventory that has not been mentioned yet. Among the listed bedding items, recorded alongside the wool blankets and fur-lined coverlet, is a single entry for a folded wool cloth described as being kept at the head of the bed. Not on the bed, at the head of it, separate from the pillow arrangement, separate from the blankets. Its purpose is not explained in the inventory because, to the clerk recording it, no explanation was necessary. Everyone knew what it was for. It was the reset piece. The cloth a sleeper reached for in the dark during the waking interval between first and second sleep, when the neck seal had shifted and the cold had begun to find the gap. Not a new layer, not an additional blanket. A targeted correction applied in 30 seconds to the one point in the system most vulnerable to movement. The tertiary fold, repositioned by a half-awake hand in the middle of the night, without light, without thought, because the action had been repeated enough times that it required neither. That cloth appears in the inventory between a listing of candle holders and a note about firewood allocation. It was as ordinary as either. A thermal tool so integrated into nightly life that it warranted no more description than a cup or a boot. The fact that we no longer know what it was for without a documentary to explain it is the precise measure of what was lost. Across the full span of this system, from the straw foundation to that folded cloth at the head of the bed, what emerges is not a collection of clever workarounds. It is a complete thermodynamic philosophy. Medieval sleepers understood, without the vocabulary of physics, that the body is a heat engine with a fixed output, and that the only variable within their control was how much of that output they could retain. Every component addressed a specific loss pathway. Nothing was redundant, nothing was decorative. The linen wicked, the wool absorbed and generated, the straw insulated from below, the enclosure eliminated convection, the bolster raised the blanket threshold, the secondary pillow reduced neck exposure, the tertiary fold sealed the remaining gap. 7 components, 3 minutes of assembly, 0 external energy. An R value that a modern Arctic sleeping bag, engineered with synthetic materials and tested in controlled laboratory conditions, still does not match. The system worked not because medieval people were ingenious in some romantic sense, but because they had no margin for failure. Cold was not uncomfortable. Cold was lethal. Necessity produced precision, and precision, repeated across generations, became ritual. Then the ritual was forgotten because the necessity disappeared. Central heating arrived. The curtains came down. The sequence dissolved. What replaced it was warmth by compensation rather than warmth by prevention. A thermostat holding a room at 68 degrees is a cruder solution than a bolster at shoulder height. It costs more, consumes fuel continuously, and fails completely the moment power is interrupted. Winter, 1389, Kenilworth Castle. 23 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Lord Edmund draws his curtain. The folded cloth sits at the head of the bed. The system is already working before he closes his eyes. 636 years later, the physics have not changed. The wool still absorbs. The dead air still holds. The neck is still the gap. The sequence still takes 3 minutes. What changed is only that we stopped teaching it because we decided we no longer needed to know. Every winter power outage since then has been a reminder that the decision was premature. Textile historians and sleep researchers are now revisiting these systems with tools that did not exist a decade ago. Infrared thermal imaging of reconstructed medieval bed enclosures, conducted in research contexts aligned with the growing interest in passive thermal design, confirms the 15 to 20 degree differential documented in Historia Prime's December 2025 analysis. Wool fiber research published in Materials, Science literature continues to find properties in natural crimp structures that synthetic alternatives have not replicated. The interest is not nostalgic, it is practical. As energy costs rise and grid reliability becomes a genuine concern across Northern Europe and North America, the question of how to sleep warm without power is no longer historical, it is current. The answers are 6 centuries old and have been sitting in household inventories, manuscript illustrations, and the memory of a folded cloth kept at the head of a bed in Kenilworth Castle, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Lord Edmund's bedding system generated an R value of 12 to 15. The best modern Arctic sleeping bag generates 8. The difference is not technology, it is sequence. 3 minutes of correct assembly, performed in the right order before the curtain is drawn. The knowledge existed. It was never lost. It was only stopped being passed on. Those are not the same thing. Textile historians and sleep researchers are now revisiting these systems with tools that did not exist a decade ago. Infrared thermal imaging of reconstructed medieval bed enclosures, conducted in research contexts aligned with the growing interest in passive thermal design, confirms the 15 to 20 degree differential documented in Historia Prime's December 2025 analysis. Wool fiber research published in Materials, Science literature continues to find properties in natural crimp structures that synthetic alternatives have not replicated. The interest is not nostalgic, it is practical. As energy costs rise and grid reliability becomes a genuine concern across Northern Europe and North America, the question of how to sleep warm without power is no longer historical, it is current. What the imaging work has revealed goes beyond temperature confirmation. When researchers mount infrared sensors inside a reconstructed enclosed bed and track heat distribution across a full 8-hour sleep cycle, a pattern emerges that the historical record implied but could not prove. The warmth does not distribute evenly, it stratifies. The lowest air layer, immediately above the wool foundation, holds the highest temperature. The middle zone, where the body lies wrapped in linen and wool blankets, maintains a stable band. The upper zone, near the canopy, runs cooler but still significantly warmer than the surrounding room. That thermal stratification is not a flaw in the system, it is the system functioning as designed. The warmest air stays where the body needs it most. The The cooler air at the canopy acts as a secondary buffer, slowing the rate at which heat escapes upward through any gap in the curtaining. A modern open bed has no such stratification. Heat rises uniformly and disperses into the room. The body loses warmth from its upper surface continuously throughout the night. The enclosed bed converts that same upward heat movement into a layered thermal shield. The physics are identical. The architecture determines the outcome. The wool research adds a dimension that even the historical sources did not articulate. Modern fiber analysis, using scanning electron microscopy at magnifications unavailable to any medieval textile worker, has mapped the precise geometry of the crimp structure in heritage wool breeds. Breeds like the Herdwick, which grazed the upland fells of northern England throughout the medieval period, produce fibers with a tighter, more irregular crimp than modern commercially bred sheep. That irregular crimp creates air pockets of varying sizes rather than uniform ones. Varying pocket sizes matter because they trap air across a wider range of pressure conditions. When a sleeper shifts weight and compresses one section of the blanket, the irregular crimp structure maintains insulation in adjacent sections where the larger pockets have not yet collapsed. A blanket woven from Herdwick-type wool degrades its insulation value under compression more slowly than a blanket woven from modern fine wool breeds selected for softness rather than thermal resilience. Medieval weavers did not know this in those terms. They knew which fleeces made blankets that lasted through January. The selection pressure was survival. The result, confirmed by microscopy 6 centuries later, was a fiber geometry that modern breeding programs have not prioritized and have not replicated. There is a parallel line of evidence that the imaging and fiber research together illuminate. The waking interval between first and second sleep, the period Ekirch documented as lasting roughly an hour around midnight, was not thermally neutral. A sleeper who rises, moves through a cold room, perhaps tends a fire or uses a chamber pot, and then returns to bed is not returning to the same thermal environment they left. In a modern heated bedroom, the bed cools slightly during absence and rewarms quickly. In a medieval chamber at 40 degrees Fahrenheit, the enclosed bed behaves differently. The curtains, drawn during the waking interval, preserve the interior temperature with remarkable efficiency. The dead air column inside the enclosure, undisturbed by the sleeper's absence, retains the warmth accumulated during the first 4 hours of sleep. When the sleeper returns, they are not climbing into a cold bed. They are re-entering a thermal environment that has held most of its temperature while they were gone. The enclosed bed functions, during that waking interval, as a passive heat storage system. No fuel required, no maintenance required. The curtain does the work, and the tertiary fold, repositioned on return, reseals the one point that movement has disrupted. The system resets in under a minute. That reset capability, the ability to recover full thermal function after a waking interruption without any active reheating, is something no modern bedding configuration can match without powered assistance. The answers are 6 centuries old and have been sitting in household inventories, manuscript illustrations, and the memory of a folded cloth kept at the head of a bed in Kenilworth Castle, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Lord Edmund's bedding system generated an R value of 12 to 15. The best modern Arctic sleeping bag generates 8. The difference is not technology, it is sequence. 3 minutes of correct assembly, performed in the right order before the curtain is drawn. The knowledge existed. It was never lost. It was only stopped being passed on. Those are not the same thing.